Well, welcome everyone to another edition of Bookish and Base, where I catch up with Jordan Knight from Migration Watch Australia. And this week we were both down in Sydney for the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference. What did you make of that, Jordan? I'm quite interested to find out.
Yeah. It was good. I think, we were speaking a bit about it before. I think a lot of the people that I met there, I would have never otherwise met in no circumstance. And what I do like about them is that it seems to be that the establishment conservatives, people like Tony Abbott and people who have been in the game for a long time, they've kind of come to this understanding. There was a lot of talk about declinism and things like that. And I think everybody's sort of now vocalizing what they're all feeling, which is that things are in decline, and I think that's a healthy, important thing. And I like that. As conservatives, it was a fairly blatantly conservative sort of group. They're now no longer about looking just to the past, and we've got to go back to Adam Smith times, and we've got to just go back to our religious roots. It was they were talking about the future, right? And it's a bit like airy fairy, like telling our new story or something like that. But the fact that the shifting perspective from the past to the future, I think, is as a necessary thing for the right, and it's kind of the new right is all about kind of has a futurist lens as well. So yeah, I mean, my minor criticism that I was thinking of the whole time was we don't need an arc to sort of get us through to the end. We kind of need a battleship sort of thing. Like we need something a bit more stronger with substance and fight. And I just don't want to survive, and try and live the rest of my life out on this arc thing.
Yeah.
I kind of want to try and win. But yeah, anyway, you've been a couple of times, I think. What were your thoughts?
That's only been, I went to the London. Yeah, we need an arc with like weaponized, not not a defensive ship, but something with, I don't know, guided missiles. I went to the London one. I mean, it is a different style. Stylistically, ARC is different to sort of any other conservative related function I've ever attended, in that it does aim to have this high-minded arts and culture element to it. And that's interesting. I mean, I think I was saying just before that it's interesting that literally less than a week ago, Trump was serving McDonald's and communicating. So there are risks in being seen as elitist and not being, man of the people or woman of the people. But I also think conservatives over the years have, you've got to be, that is our heritage. That is something to be celebrated. And you can mix the two. Trump rallies, they do have, I think they do play Pavarotti at the end occasionally. So it is possible to sort of, to do both. Yeah. I mean, the substance of it, London was slightly different. You had a few more slightly, not eccentric, but slightly less normie conservatives who had speaking slots, and there are certainly a lot more interesting types that were not on the podium that you were hanging out with. Australia's a smaller market and for different reasons, but I still think ARC it's still 1980s classical liberalism, essentially, with a art and culture gloss to it. And maybe that's just how they have to start off. Maybe they will change in due course. I mean, they Jordan Peterson says some things, and people, there's some criticism, but I think basically like the John Anderson and Neil Ferguson and the rest of the types, they all sort of are harking back to a little bit to the let's get back to the 1980s, early 90s. They recognize the problem, but they haven't and everyone's agreed on that the symptoms we're experiencing are bad, but they haven't quite proposed the real solution, other than like believe and tell a better story, and like, don't young people understand the glories of civilization stuff. I don't know. That's so I'm not writing it off. It's just I think they haven't decided themselves precisely, and it's great to get people together to think about it all. But whether it has staying power would depend on, the real solutions that they offer.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's almost a fundamental error maybe that they've made, and it's easy to correct. I mean, they can't just do these annual conferences and just repeat the same message over and over again. I think, especially if they think they have the answer, which we might have questions about. I think maybe it might be better served if it was, instead of saying, here's what we need to do, actually there was a sort of discussion of different sort of approaches. I mean, to be honest, I'm not even sure if the John Andersons of the world really even know that there are sort of these sort of emerging different strains on the right of thought who are proposing different solutions. I mean, maybe it's up to us to kind of say to them, well, there's actually a different, there's different discussions to be had. You can't just go up on stage and say the same thing every year. So maybe if they switch from this is what we need to be doing to how do we get to where we want to go to that format, I think that might be interesting.
Yeah, they are feeling as they go a little bit. I think they're broadly, I know, because there's some NatCon types who are somewhat associated with ARC, but it's not a NatCon type of message. And yeah, look, I had an article in a Spectator where I just contrasted what mainstream centre-right types in Australia believe on trade, immigration, and foreign policy with what JD Vance and Donald Trump and others say, and there's a big contrast. And ARC wasn't saying, and this is one of my criticisms of London, right? Literally, as they were there was 3 days of interesting talks about all sorts of interesting sort of stuff, but zero on immigration, or the barest mentions, if anything. I didn't certainly it wasn't front and center. And as they were talking on that stage, 2K down the road, there were people chanting, "Death to Israel." It was big sort of, and so decent John Anderson telling a different story to those guys with respect is not going to solve mine. And they're very big on this. It's a civilizational moment. Well, guys, you've let in this different civilization.
Yes.
So, that's unless you kind of tackle that, I don't know whether they sort of still think it's like an Oxbridge debate where the better person who makes the better argument wins, and I don't know. I don't
know if you saw Mark Latham's criticisms that he wrote about it last year. Did you see that?
No, I didn't know. Yeah.
So it's actually worth reading. He got back from ARC and he wrote a Facebook thread about what his thoughts were. He said, it was fine, it was good, but he commented on how it was overly religious. And he also sort of made the point that Australia is largely non-religious. It's a secular sort of country, working class, especially. And I think there's kind of a decent point there, and this is something that I'm sort of grappling with at the moment. Is that a lot of people on the right, especially ARC people, sort of place a lot of emphasis on religion, and that's necessary and that's fair, but less so on the nation sort of thing. Like whereas I didn't grow up terribly religious. I mean, I think there's obviously huge value in it, but I am kind of one to sort of put the nation, I think, first, just because I think where we are at the moment. It's that I think that sort of creates a problem. It goes back to what you're saying about like the Palestine protests that were happening 2K down the street. If you're scared about what's happening to your nation as opposed to your religion and civilization, you'd be like, well, hold on, there's guys down the street who want to invade our civilization, sort of thing. So, yeah.
Oh, no, I agree. And there's an evangelical element to it. I think Philippa Shroud and her husband, there's a lot of William Wilberforce and that we abolished the slave trade and this stuff.
Yeah.
I always think, yeah, good guy, but why were there no slaves in Rome, in the Colosseum at that time, dude? I mean, well before William Wilberforce came on the scene. But it is a slant to it all, but all good and nice stuff. But yeah, I'm with you. I just don't believe the powers. If you think you need to remoralize society, a la William Wilberforce and stuff, or that you can. I think Mr. Shroud had a big talk about the rugby school and how it was, terrible place to live, and that it became, a great school under Matthew Arnold or someone. But yeah, but they did that immigration wasn't an issue. It wasn't as though they had to deal with a society, and so many of the causes they do go on about the decline of the West, but they just sort of feel like, I don't know, they mention someone like a Robert Putnam, the Harvard sociologist, but they don't explain what he actually said. He said that, social institutions and everything will break down because of increasing cultural diversity. And that's not the point that they made. They sort of, it's almost as though they never explain true or have decided on what the true causes of this are, other than a sort of vague, we've lost our way,
Yes. Yeah. It felt to me they're trying to wage this massive civilizational battle. It kind of struck me in a leftist frame, like they're making all these we stop slavery, and they kept admitting the entire time that Australia isn't perfect and has an imperfect history, and they kept just going back to that, and I'm like, shut up! Why are you talking about leftist talking points? It was the most unnecessary thing possible. I mean, you should have, if you want to build any winning movement, you should have total confidence in yourself, in who you are. And if you want to sort of disparage your history, just let the other side do that, because they're going to do it relentlessly anyway. So yeah, I found that very frustrating. But,
so did I. It's almost as though they're trying to demonstrate that they're reasonable, and they're apologizing for some of the people that. That's not how you kind of go into battle at Agincourt, is it? It's like
well, they're also at risk as well. This is a free advice arc. You're at risk of being left behind. I mean, if Trump gets in, Jenrick gets in the UK. Jenrick is, say what you want, but he has been saying sort of more national conservative things, right? And so suddenly ARC will become redundant if they just hold on to these 1980s religious, free trade, free market, don't talk about the naughty stuff. People stop caring. I mean, they've got to adjust in my opinion.
I think I have hope for them. If we tell them a different story, they'll come around, or they'll see they have, it's a big enough tent there that I think that they can, and they will tack on depending which way the political winds go. I mean, look, I met Miriam Cates, who was an ex UK MP, and she was she literally at ARC, and she was literally NatCon stuff, and that's where she asked me, what's going on with national conservatism in Australia, and it was literally the kind of prompt for putting something together here. But so they do exist, and I think that the guys from ARC that I've spoken to are very sympathetic to those type of people. I imagine they will be, supporting of, I don't know, would they be supporting of who I haven't following closely enough, the UK leadership, Jenrick, and there's Jemmy or whatever her name is, she's a Nigerian black, says some
Badenoch.
And he's definitely pushing the immigration stuff a lot further. So it'll be a real test to see where the UK lands there. And man, I'm not. People are really bullish on Trump. I think it's going to be super, super close, and it will be a real test to see whether. Look, this is my other major gripe with this. They really do think that it's an ideological battle, and it is to a certain extent. But California's never going to vote for Trump, right? And there's a reason for that. It's not like ideological. It's because the state changed since the days of Ronald Reagan demographically, and the question in the US election is whether all those swing states have become California. I don't know. Maybe they have already, and in which case it doesn't really. I mean, not to be down on it, but that's the real risk here, and it's not telling a better story. I don't know, like
yeah. I mean, my concern is that a lot of it, and I am not disparaging to Christians whatsoever.
No.
I'm on my own journey, but my concern is that in the they a lot of people have on the right have hope and faith that if we bring voters in, good Christian voters, they will see that the right center right party is the best for them and they'll vote. And this never ever has has worked properly. Like sure, some might, but largely the data shows that overwhelmingly migrants in both America and Australia, I believe, disproportionately vote for left-wing parties. And that's just, I don't think telling about a story is going to change that. I'm sorry. I don't think ARC is convincing enough, or places like ARC is going to be convincing enough to sufficiently and rapidly change the voting intention of large migrants.
I agree. It's 100% agree. It's very hard to make that argument to people because let's not of the 80s 90s era, because they still at some point think that it's Hawke Keating having debates and the country is as it was then, and they think, oh, I've got this nice Chinese or Indian or a friend, and they vote LNP or Liberals or whatever, conservative. But it's that line that we lose money on every sale, but we make it up on volume. I mean, you might win 30% of a particular but the more of that group that comes in and you're losing 70, the more you will lose overall. So great, you win 30, but you'll lose overall. So focus on the ones you can win. And they do think that they can be St. Paul and evangelize the whole country, and maybe I don't know, that's a big ask. I just think focus on the actual cultural kind of unit that you have at the moment and strengthen that, and you will. And then that, once you've got a sort of more cohesive group, then you can sort of try to make them go to church more as well, if that's what you want.
It's a good point. I think who was it, Burnham or something like that, said that every regime, every elite needs to constantly sort of swap out. It's not completely one for one swap out, but just constantly bring in new blood, fresh ideas. Otherwise, it will just become too sclerotic and redundant and will die. And I think there is a kind of, that's happened in America. MAGA has come in and that's completely revitalized basically the right, and now they're doing pretty okay. And not so much happening here. I think, it's this old story, the same old story. I wrote, it was like my second article, I think, that I wrote for The Spectator a couple of years ago. It's like look, I believe that there needs to be an elite, right? I'm pro elite, whatever. But if you're too elite for too long, you're removed from the realities of the hard realities of nature and of the current moment, which are that certain demographics will vote a certain way and act a certain way. And I think they do need to bring in new blood that isn't necessarily elite, that is probably not an Oxford or UCID Rhodes Scholar or something like that. And there needs to, I think there should, if the right ever wants to sort of regain vitality in the battle space or some shit, right? Like they should bring in some sort of hardcore elements, in my opinion. Maybe I'm speaking purely out of self-interest here, but there should be working class sort of additions to this. Otherwise you become decadent and redundant.
Yeah, they haven't there isn't really the MAGA issues here yet. For example, the foreign policy stuff, there hasn't been a reassessment in Australia. There's no, John Howard and Tony Abbott and Neil Ferguson and what were they talking about? The new axis of evil or whatever it was.
Of ill will, I think.
Ill will, axis of ill will, yeah. And and it's like, where have I had this before? And it's, I don't know. I find that neoconservatism, which had its heyday back in 2000 and early 2001, where that surely, guys, you now have had enough time to think through this and realize that the results of that have not been what were promised. And that's a popular thing. I mean, that's it's not popular in think tank world. It's not popular in particular, baby boomer sets of a generation. But that's a 70% issue. 70% of Australia, 70% of the United States will agree with Trump that it was an absolute disaster. I mean, he has that bombastic language, but he's not wrong. And likewise, they're not on trade. Australia, you try to tell, any of them, like Neil Ferguson, he was, I'm a Scot and, I believe in free Adam Smith. Great, dude. So, but then you go on to say the Glaswegian ship, industry is completely down, and there've been all these social ills as a result. Well, why did that happen? China produces, it's the largest shipbuilder in the world. I mean, okay,
It is funny. They spoke a lot about free trade. They even sort of wheeled out Jordan Peterson to talk about free markets, which I didn't understand for the life of me. Maybe there's a business element or a donor element to this. I'm not too sure, but it was. I still find it funny that in the same, we're 2 weeks out from the US election. There's basically a NatCon vice president about to. He is a new possible vice president, and at the same time, we're still talking about free trade and free markets when people like JD Vance, who are about to be at the top, the second top position in the biggest country of the free world, is he's basically opened and spoken against free markets and free trade and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, at least realize there's there needs to be a readjustment of some description. Like it is weird, right? You've got this really articulate guy who actually lived, went to Iraq, lived in, deindustrialized Ohio, thoughtful, he's saying these things, but these guys are like, oh, well, I mean, I don't know what they think. I genuinely don't know what is, I mean, Jordan Peterson, he's actually, I think he had Tommy Robinson or something on his podcast. So he's not completely averse to discussing some hard issues, but what does he really know about trade, man? Like like no idea. What is he? Where is Jordan Peterson on foreign policy? I don't know.
Immigration. Yeah,
probably okay on immigration. Okay. I think. Yeah. Oh well, I don't know. I mean, who knows? It certainly wasn't front and foremost. You don't think to yourself, Jordan Peterson immigration restrictions, do you? It's not immediately come to mind, but but look, there were some other ones. The most sort of moving ones were, well, the most hard hitting, I suppose, were the ones on early childhood education and raising kids, because they're very much focused on there's a pro-natalist sort of element to it all, and how families can raise kids better, which I'm very sympathetic to, and I think the audience was overall. But I question whether, again, how did this happen? Like, you try to hold on to these like traditional units and ways of life when the economic and other system that you've created makes it really, really hard for them to get off the ground. So that's my take on it all. But
well, I guess it's just says to us that there's still a space for the NatCon argument that is just being is crying out for. I think the day that we have Pauline Hanson speaking at ARC is when.
Well, it won't be Pauline, right? It'll be someone. Why wanted a JD Vance speak at ARC? I mean, or at least some of that nature. They kind of have. I don't know. His name wasn't, Donald Trump's name wasn't, JD Vance's name wasn't mentioned at all.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is odd, right? It's still the biggest sort of, nation on earth. They've got an election in a week's time. You're having a conservative conference about it, and yet no mention. I find that
It is interesting. Yeah, it is interesting as well that it's Arc London, Arc Sydney, but no Arc America.
Yeah, I mean, I think they do. From what I chatting with John Anderson and a few other people, they've certainly said that they wanted to have not to be swamped by the Americans arc and to actually give Australians greater prominence too, which is a good thing. And well, from my perspective, and it did. I liked it in London in particular, the fact that you had a lot of Europeans there, because actually, the Europeans tend to be the butt of American jokes. Oh, they're backward and they have long, holidays and this, that, and the other. But some of the more traditional European takes, which were in the 80s derided as, inefficient, where the guy comes home for lunch, or they work closely, or they have much more corporatist type of economic systems, actually probably are more beneficial to, I don't know, family life than the kind of dog-eat-dog American hyper, whatever you want to call it, capitalism. I think I don't mind that not being swamped by the Americans. I think they have an interesting kind of perspective. And in fact, the Americans at ARC, Kevin McCarthy, the ex-speaker, he was, he was hopeless. He was like, you want boomer-con conservatism, he gave it to you in spades. But then you had Vivek, who spoke. He gets it. So there was some much more interesting, wider range of speakers there. So, but that you can only do so much in a day, I suppose, in Sydney. What else? Yeah. So,
did you want to talk about what were your thoughts on Trump's McDonald's? Because you made the point about the high culture v low culture. I mean, what are your?
Oh well, I think it was a genius political campaign move. Apart from anything else, it's a great way of like getting a whole bunch of this fast food, but it's like you meet a lot of people. You're having them one-on-one, and I think, and it was great optics and sort of genius. I mean, I don't know, he's kind of a funny looking guy, Trump, actually, but he has this capacity to generate these iconic moments.
Yeah.
I don't know how you explain that.
you cannot create that with consultants or manufacture that. I think I keep coming back to the point that he is just the single most genuine guy kind of in politics at the moment. I think he didn't jump up and shout fight with his fist in the air because he thought this will win me some votes and this will look good on TV like some people suggested. He genuinely meant it. He's like, I almost died. I want America to fight on. I just think he loves America, to be honest. I mean, look, if that's not the case and he's a cynical political player and he's just good at what he does, then that's impressive. But I think he's genuine.
Oh, I think he's got an ego on him. I think he's probably not as well versed in sort of all the arguments that he makes, but he does have an instinctive ability to sort of punch through. In that, like all the Australian and other people, they react in a very sort of tut way when Trump says tariffs are the greatest thing ever invented, or tariffs need a PR company. And it's sort of deliberately provocative, but it punches through and it makes it clear that there needs to be some think. It makes people think, right? Like, whereas tariffs did become like this bogey word that, if you mentioned obviously that means you're some sort of complete economic illiterate. He has a real talent for that, but I don't know, man. I don't know whether they get ahead. I don't think anyone knows, to be honest.
Who's going to win? Yeah. No.
I watched people who are on Twitter who were pretty good last time, have been pretty good in other elections, and even they are saying there's so much that there'll be fraud. There'll be a lot of things a lot harder to pick than it once was. And also, I think that there's only so many swing states, and 2016 he kind of caught them on the hop, whereas now they're just the Democrats are just going to have their get the vote out campaign in Wisconsin and Michigan, and if you can't win some of those states, then there's only so many that I don't know. Maybe it's just a bit black pilly. I don't know. I think it could be pretty grim.
Yes. How many was it? Mark Krikorian who said that there's been 13 million or something illegal migrants under the Biden administration. Is that correct?
Or he said he didn't know the full number, but But I don't know. They see this. It all comes down to numbers, right? Politics is a numbers game, and I don't know whether I've seen any hard data on how many of those have actually now get voting rights, because that's significant. 6 million new ones. Well, that turns elections, especially when they've been parked in places like Springfield, Ohio, and other places like that. I mean, the last elections have always, the last presidential elections have been close. There's only been 100 or 1,000 votes spread across key counties which have turned it. So if you've got 6 million who suddenly vote a particular way or predominantly a way, that is
it could be. I mean, and if Kamala does get in, that's another 4 years of continued open borders, and that it will just be perma Democrat probably.
I genuinely do think, and no matter how many telling different stories or this, that, and the other, I mean, that'll be consequential. I mean, that'll be.
That's it. I mean, talking to American friends, they're like not to over dramatize things, but they're like, this really could be like the last sort of election, like that many million migrants in that many years. I mean, they say like America's a good country and there's still a lot left to destroy, but it would be on a bad trend if.
California, they always say California is what America's future looks like. Well, California is a one-party Democratic state with an underclass. No one thinks. I mean, actually, I do hear people say, "Oh, if only we get a more kind of attractive candidate, or with a more genial smile to make messages in California. Oh, it doesn't focus on some of the more hard." No. Nixon wasn't charismatic, that guy, but he carried California easily. Reagan had his charms, but it could also be pretty hard. He wasn't all sunshine and lollipops on Reagan either. So it's not. I don't know. It's got to get real, and it may be the whole of the US does become California, and then all these nice little arguments that you have about politics don't matter all that much because.
No, that's true. I mean, I was just last night watching a movie that was set in Brazil, and I think a few other commentators have sort of said, that Brazil, people are like, do we go to South Africa? Do we become California? Do we become Brazil? I think the Brazilification is interesting because it is to an extent a functioning country that still produces things like airplanes and things like that, and it has relatively strongly enforced social structures, right? Like different kind of, but it has this strongly, what would you call it? It's not an egalitarian flat society. Like there's the Elysiums and then there's the hellholes, right? And they're probably separated by armed private guards, quite literally. And
but that kind of society, you've got really rich and you've got the kind of favela class who are.
And America will always be a rich country, right? I mean, unless something absolutely catastrophic happens. So you can kind of see, and I know for a fact as well that there are elements within the right in America that are kind of entertaining that option. They're like, we need an exit ramp that is realistic, and people are moving to set these planned kind of aligned towns that are being made. Like it's pretty amazing watching what's happening. Like people are getting ready for the collapse of America in a way. So
who knows? One of the ladies who did come through McDonald's, she did say, please don't make us turn into Brazil. So I guess even at unless it was all a setup, she's making the same points that pointy-headed political types are making too.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's a viable option. I mean, look, it'll mean the total displacement of the working class. I don't know what would happen to them if it does sort of Brazilify, and they will just get absolutely decimated and probably demographically just destroy that, unless they make their way into the gated communities somehow. I can't see how the working class will survive.
Well, I think that's the people like to talk about like Argentina and the Peronism and how that changed what was once one of the richest countries in the world, and the parallel is always drawn with Australia because it was in 1900 like us, rich, and then it went downhill. But I read some interesting stuff, and the reason for its decline wasn't an ideological one. It's because they had so many poor migrants come in which is where Evita and these guys got their political support. Whereas Chile, with the massive Andes, the migrants, it was the wall. They weren't able to get across there. So it was because that's the southern cone of South America. It was all Italians and Germans and Eastern European. It was quite, you go to Buenos Aires and Kirchner, who's last name, and they're Italian last names. They're not Martinez and Lopez, at least in the capital cities. So it's actually kind of a lesson, and that's the one. It's let's talk about like the Berlin Wall and the kind of Hitler in the foreign policy stuff, and more focus about the South Americanization of the West, which is
yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, I don't know. You go to New York City, it doesn't feel like an American city. Like it has American media. That's about it. Like it is the entire police force, as far as I could tell, was Hispanic. Same with like EMTs and emergency services. It was and this is a neutral judgment. I mean, it's still a functioning, good, fun, rich city, right? So, but it's it does feel sort of like the sort of Brazilified sort of and the problem, we're in this funny period where we're not quite building elysiums with private security guards, and so there's still a lot of just the other week there was like a former, I think, governor or former mayor of New York just getting assaulted on the streets, and it's like, well, that's
there was the New York governor. I saw that. Right. There's so much that comes through the social media. I did notice that one. Yeah, he's
so you go to New York and you kind of like, this just feels like a very advanced state of the West if you don't things, but anyway, that's
well, it just doesn't become the arguments and the paths for victory politically in those places are not socialism v whatever capitalism. It's ethnic politics and weird coalitions and patronage to different groups. It's a different, like, much more messy arrangement, which it's not as good as what it once was, even
though that's perfect. No, I think democracy combined with massive demographic change through immigration hasn't really been tried before, and it kind of like works in the capacity that, like, I don't know, like on paper it kind of works, and we're still living in a democratic country, but does it still serve the interests of the nation?
Well, you I think I've seen you on your Twitter quote Lee Kuan Yew, and he makes, like, the former leader of Singapore, he said that multi-ethnic democracies don't work because people don't vote on the basis of economic interests. They predominantly vote on the basis of whether it's good for their kind of group. And again, that's never the way it was meant to work. And hopefully it won't work that way, but you also do have to recognize reality that it does work that way in many cases. So,
I mean, this is why, I mean, I cop flack sometimes for talking about assimilation. I mean, people are like, we don't want to sort of assimilate, we just want to be ourselves, and fine. But it's like, if you don't assimilate, you're just you'll have a multinational country where people just vote in their own people's interest and national interest. If you do as Lee Kuan Yew did, which is kind of, he really stabilized, I think, demographics and made sure that there was like a set sort of boundaries on demographics in terms of percentage, like just hard numbers, and then really enforced the idea of a Singaporean identity rather than any other identity. I think that and Singapore's doing well, so I think
also it's not quite, it's a managed democracy, and there's restrictions on speech, and there's predominantly kind of still predominantly Chinese. I mean, it was created to be a little homeland for Chinese that were getting beaten up in Malaysia, really. So it's sort of but yeah, no, on we go, man. Let's see how it all pans out. I mean, the US, well, there's the Queensland election this weekend, but that's not going to be quite as monumental as the US one.
I don't know. It could be.
how that fall? Well, from here, let word go forth that a new
Queensland should be
generation is arising. Yeah. So we'll see. And then after the US election, which I think I'll be in Brisbane. That's a chance I might be out of town. But yeah, who knows? We'll see.
Do you have tips or thoughts on what's going to happen in the Queensland election?
I think the LNP will win, and I think they'll win in the outer suburbs. I think some of the more inner sub ones that they were hoping to win back. I mean, the reality check is Campbell Newman, who has been on the podcast before. Last time he was premier, he won a seat called Ashgrove, which has now been renamed, which is in the city of Brisbane. Well, there's no chance that'll probably fall to a Green, or definitely there's no chance the LNP will win that one. So that's a pretty dramatic change. But they might win seats like Mackay, which they've never won before, and they might win seats, outer suburb seats. There's still plenty of outer suburb seats in Brisbane. And I had a look at the results of the Voice campaign, like the referendum, and you just see this big cliff once you get sort of after 5 or 6K outside the city. The yes vote just sort of starts to just drop off dramatically. So that's where your voters are. But hopefully they'll pull the right trigger. Anyway, I might leave it to it, get into it, and get to work. And we'll check in the next week or so when all sorts of political results come in.
Sounds good. All right. See ya.
Good talk. See you. Bye.